recording. Well, hello and welcome to another Hidden Herstory podcast. Today I've got another special guest here to chat to, and this is actually our first international guest. We feel quite honoured that we have artist and writer Renee Gerlich. Hello. Is it Gerlich or Gerlich?
Welcome to our...
Do you know what? I actually alternate. Because it's Gerlich, it's Dutch, so you can choose. But yeah, go with Gerlich.
I hope you've been enjoying.
Right. Oh, sorry, I just had something in the background there that I needed to turn off. I could hear my own voice. Yes. So anyway, we've got Renee here, and Renee is going to talk about her new series of books, which you can see behind me. It is called A Brief, Complete Herstory. And being an English teacher, I'm picking up on those two words straight away. Complete and brief are very kind of almost at two ends of the spectrum, aren't they, Renee?
Yeah.
So one of the questions, I mean, I'm sure we're going to answer this in the podcast, is how do you go about condensing, you know, centuries of women's history into, how many volumes of your book have you got?
There's 7.
7. So you've got 7 volumes of this book, and I'm really fascinated. I know that I want to find out more about the book. So can you just tell us a bit about yourself first, and what sort of inspired you to write these books? That's what I'm most interested in.
Yes, sure. And I have to say, I've just done this interview as well with the Green Flame about the books, and another one that's coming out with Women's Liberation Radio News, which is a great platform. Mm-hmm. And I don't want to overlap too much with those. Okay. And I also love what you do at hiddenherstory.com. And I feel like I'm really excited to talk with you in a way that matches what you're doing. So I'll try and keep some of this.
And feel free to ask me any questions about the website. I'm sure there's things that we'll connect on, you know, that we're both sort of trying to do similar things. So feel free to ask me questions as well while we're here together. So
well, one thing that struck me looking at your work is that it's really similar in that we're both talking about women who are left out of mainstream history, but it is almost the polar opposite of what I do, in that your stories are even more obscure than the ones that I've found, and they're offered kind of in random. There's no sequence or order, so it's like, which is amazing. So I've done the opposite, which is to create a continuous narrative, one continuous narrative. And the purpose of what I've done with the Brief Complete Herstory has really been about the narrative, because I wanted a narrative of history that could help me understand the world better. So I actually just discovered your website recently, and when I did, I thought, this would have been useful as a resource for me, but I'm also really glad I didn't find it, because I would have been overwhelmed. Like, I would have wanted to include everybody, and I couldn't do that. So when I wrote my narrative and my volumes, I obviously had to be really selective about choosing those women who really represented the zeitgeist, or you know, who were really, you know, so in the 4th book, I talk about the suffragists, for instance, and Emmeline Pankhurst, who most feminists know who Emmeline Pankhurst is. So she's highlighted.
She's one of the more well-known sort of, you know, women.
Yeah.
Which is why I love all the stories about the people that kind of were following her. You know, there's these big names, and everybody writes about them, and they're obviously really big, important names to include. Yeah. But like, as you say, the ones I find are the obscure people that you've never heard of.
Yeah, exactly. And so my motivation was more about, because a lot of feminists refer to the period of suffrage as the first wave of feminism, which in a way is a funny idea, because it suggests that there wasn't any feminism before that.
Absolutely. And there was so much, wasn't there?
Yeah. that implies that these women just came out of nowhere.
That's it.
So
I think my interest, I think my interest first came in women's history when I was doing my undergraduate degree when I was about 30, and I picked a thesis which was, I loved 19th century literature. And I remember kind of, I knew stuff. I wasn't really a history person then, I was more of a literature person. But I remember reading The Vindication of the Rights of Women, because my undergraduate thesis was on the silencing of women in Victorian sensation fiction. And I remember, that's the first time I'd really come across Mary Wollstonecraft. And so, feminism started way back from the suffragettes, and that's my understanding, that it sort of started a long time before that, and probably Mary Wollstonecraft, and there was quite a few other women who were campaigning for women's rights, so you're absolutely right. Everybody sort of pins Emmeline Pankhurst and the suffragettes as the beginning of the first wave of feminism, but it does go back a lot further, and I'm sure your books are going to take us right back to the beginning, aren't they, really? Of everything.
Yeah. And well, so in my books start from the beginning of from the Big Bang, and then the evolution of life, and then they talk about matriarchy,
right?
And they kind of say and I'm aware that some people don't like that term because they think it represents some kind of bias toward a female supremacist society or something like that. But the way that I talk about it and the way that I've read about it, it's much more about a natural way for humans to live and organize ourselves. Children come out of their mothers, they grow up with their mothers, they have the birthright to the land that their mothers live on. To me, there's nothing utopian or hypothetical or wild about that proposition. And so if that's true, and if a matriarchal way of life is our nature, then that means we have been protesting from the beginning.
Absolutely.
Unconsciously or consciously, because that's the nature that we want to live, and it goes again, patriarchy goes against our nature. I mean, this is obvious. This is why we don't just have violence and oppression, but also depression and anxiety and all of these kinds of issues. The human being is not into this. And so then the books kind of show how women have been resisting as long as we've been oppressed. I would actually love to know how far back your hidden Herstory, like when is your earliest?
Oh gosh, well, the way I find these stories, I mean, one day it could be a Victorian woman, the next day it could be, somebody from the 12th century. I happen to just sort of discover these stories, and I discover sort of books and stuff. So at the moment, I'm reading a book where basically it gives you a woman a day. And that covers, again, like so many different periods of history. So at the moment we don't really go back, we're only going back as far as I think the oldest story on there sort of goes back to the 19th century. But in my other blog, my old blog, we didn't actually have very many. I don't think we really concentrated on like the sort of going right back to the beginning, because I think a lot of people have this. So I think the problem for me was that going back to the further you go back, the less women there are, and I think most of the bloggers and most of the people podcasting have probably covered like some of the best ones, like Hypatia and people like that. And I sort of feel that if two or three or four people have covered those people, there's no need for me to do it unless I'm chatting about those people in a general conversation with somebody. So but I found a woman the other day who was and I can't remember her name. That's the trouble when you get old. But I found, I find these women every day. So yes, we could go back to the Roman times 1 week. We could be in any period. It just depends what stories pop up, and and if I happen to sort of be reading a book and I'll find a woman from medieval times or Tudor times, if the story's interesting, for me it's not so much about the period, it's about the person and what they did, and how, and how they did it in the context of the time that they lived. So I'm not ruling out that we will have women from all different periods of history, but at the moment we've only tended to go back about 200 years, which is not a lot really. And I know compared to what you've done, we're staying up that end of the of the historical timeline at the moment. But I am interested in finding out more. There are so many women out there. That's what interests me about this. There's so many stories, and there's so many different historians who focus on different periods that every day I've got books and names, reams of names, and they're from everywhere and every period and every sphere. So there's plenty of women out there. Just so happens, if they grab my interest, or I've got a guest who wants to talk about them, then that's what I tend to focus on. But yes, there are lots of ancient women. Now I learn about them all every day, a new one. So no, we'll be doing stuff on further back in history as time goes on, I think.
Yeah.
Who's your favourite woman from that sort of period, from right back in the beginning? Who would you say would be the first sort of woman that you focus on in your early books?
So because I begin with these matriarchal cultures, there's in that sense there's kind of not. So one of the anthologies that I draw on for that is called Societies of Peace, which is a collection of essays by Indigenous women talking about the Indigenous cultures that they come from. So then paradoxically, the earliest women are also the most current.
I like that idea. Yes, that's really interesting.
Yeah, but of course those aren't resistance stories as so much as they are, women testifying to human origins, how we live, our human nature. And then I talk about the creation of patriarchy, and I think the first woman who I speak of in a feminist sense of, is in the time of King Hammurabi, or just after, so Babylon. And her name is Enheduanna. Gosh, Enheduanna, and she's the first named author.
Right.
In history.
The first named author, regardless of gender.
Yeah. So this is a period
cool.
where, this is so Babylon is the Babylonians are credited with originating writing script. Some feminists question that because I don't know if you know the scholar Maria Gumbudas, who studied Neolithic Europe.
No, that's another new name for me, so thank you.
I recommend her book, The Living Goddesses. It's amazing. So she looks at Neolithic Europe, and she looks at these symbol groups that you can find in pottery or carvings or figurines from the period. And she argues that some of the inscription that might be seen as iconographic is actually could be considered script.
Right.
So there's, but anyway, I think the cuneiform script of the Babylonians it's fair to say that's the beginning of writing.
Right.
And that was originally for records, for kind of like accounting records. But Enheduanna was a poet. And she did things like call on the goddess Inanna.
I have heard this. In fact, this rings a bell now, because it was in one of my little dip in one lady a day book, and yes, now it's coming to me. I read about her the other day, and I remember reading the poems. And yes, so there you go. I didn't make the connection that I dipped in and I read something about this woman the other day. So that's amazing. But the poems were very. It was the sort of that they were very. I'm trying to remember what I read now, but they were. They were sort of really speaking from her womanhood, weren't they? And this sort of thing hadn't been done, you know, it was centuries before its time, really, wasn't it? I think, from what I can remember reading about her.
Yeah,
that's really,
I
didn't realize I'd made that connection until you said the name, so that's really cool.
Yeah. So I think, like, as distinct from your work, my work tends to just kind of try to talk about these women and position them in a broad narrative. So you would probably tend to delve into the details of their lives and work much more. I've only done that in some cases, but I think Indahuana reminds me of Sappho a little. Like, they're both poets, and their work seems to both celebrate being women, call on these female goddesses who are older than the patriarchal stories about them, and also there's a sense of lament for a time that they are still much more closely connected with than we are now in 2021. So yeah, so I mentioned Sappho as well, and one of those books behind you. Yes. And that same one as well, talk about Boudica briefly.
Yes, Boudica is a huge one, especially because where I live in Essex, Colchester, and that area was where she was from. So Boudica's kind of like the ultimate Essex girl for us here, and those people who get the Essex girl thing, she is like, yes, we love Boudica here in Essex. She's a big one, but again, I mean, for me, so many people have written about her. And there's a book at the moment called What Does Boudica Do, which has been one of my favorite books, and it kind of meshes in sort of like life advice. It's kind of aimed at a much younger audience, I think, but for me, I loved it. But so you've got this life advice, and this book takes sort of women and then says, what for younger girls and for younger sort of women, what can you learn from this? And Boudica was about standing up for your rights and for fighting for things, and she's a big hero here in Essex for us.
So that's like a spin on the what would Jesus do?
Yes, it's kind of like and it's a great little book, but it's one of those ones you can kind of just dip into, and the chapters are, I mean, chapters are really tiny, but it will just give you a little kind of taste of who the woman was. And I think they've got like 365 or 66 women. There's quite a few little books like that now, where you can just dip in or it'll be like what happened on that day in women's history, and they're really good, I think, for people who just want to sort of dip their foot in or have never really read anything like that before. They're great books, and for younger people as well, for younger readers. So I sort of get the idea that maybe your books are a little bit like that, so you've got, because they're not massive, are they? They're
very thin.
They're brief, but they're complete. That's what I kind of liked about that. That
it is a
paradox. There's a picture of you looking at the books, and they're quite thin, and I thought, well, how has Renee managed to get all of this information into a fairly brief book? And that's the idea that fascinated me, really. So in the books, then, are you obviously you're drawing on a lot of other people's work, so is the idea sort of similar to mine, then, that people will come in, they will buy the book, they will learn something about a woman, and then maybe go off and do some further reading? Because that's the sort of idea that I had. You just give somebody a little story and hope that something will click with them, and they'll go off and actually do a bit more research and find out more about that woman. So is that something that you do in the book, then, recommend sort of other books to go and read if women want to kind of explore these feminist questions and in more detail? Is that how your books work, or have I got this totally wrong?
Yeah, they all have quite a bibliography at the back, and that was a huge part of my motivation, was to share reading recommendations. That took me a really long time, because I didn't grow up with feminism, so I had to find a lot of the stuff myself. I kind of I guess I feel like I compiled this history more than I wrote it, for sure. So it's compiled out of all these other books that I read, and I kept reading until I felt like I had a story that was continuous. There weren't any jarring gaps. So that's also why they're kind of that's what allows them to be short, because my emphasis has really been on the continuity. So I lie about them being complete. They're incomplete. I don't tell everything that has ever happened.
That's what fascinated me, because I know, like, when my biggest problem when I'm writing a blog, especially if I find a woman I'm really, really interested in, is that I can get all this information, you know, and there's so much on the internet now. You can just put in a search, and I don't find all this information, and then I've got like, oh my gosh, this is going to take me like a week to process and read and then write, and then, you know, and you just, sometimes there's just so much information on some things. How do you sort of condense it down? I have real problems because I really want to go into detail, and I have to keep saying to myself, no, you know,
my brain
keep it concise, and I'm editing things down and trying to, but then I feel, oh well, I need to keep that bit of information in, and I want to, you know, I don't want to snip that bit out. So how was that sort of a process that you went through, writing the books, of having all this material and then kind of narrowing it down to fit the narrative that you were trying to tell?
My brain works in the opposite way.
Right.
I'm not detail oriented. I'm oriented toward overviews and big picture. So I don't have to really worry about filtering detail. My brain will filter detail until I have somewhere to a big picture to place it in. Right. And that's partly why I wrote these books, because I find that frustrating. I'll learn something interesting, but I won't hold on to it because there's nowhere to put it. So if I
run out of space after a while, don't we?
I need context. That's it. I need context to absorb any information. So when I wrote these books, I was really wanting to provide an overarching context, so that when people like me find work by women like you, we can just like absorb it, because all the context is there, and just enjoy it, and rather than being like, you know, like if someone did something in 1920 and they were, I don't know, like Serbian, and you don't know any context, it's hard to appreciate exactly what that meant, and who was doing what in other places at the same time, and how that relates. So yeah, my mind is oriented toward context, so I didn't really have a problem.
That's really, I find that really interesting, but I know what you mean about information. I had many years ago, I had some head injuries, and it kind of affected the way that I process information. So I used to love reading fiction books, when that's what I did my degree in, but I found after I had the head injuries and I came out with coma, and I found that I couldn't concentrate on like fiction stories anymore, because I couldn't remember the plot, and I'd have to keep going back and rereading. And it really, you know, considering I spent so many years at university reading so many books, to all of a sudden not, and these were all sort of like fiction books and classic novels and things like that, and plays, and then that's how I kind of ended up reading more non-fiction, because my brain sort of changed, and I can take in facts, and I can, you know, if it's about, you know, it's why I started reading biographies, because I'd picked biographies of people that I was interested in, didn't know a lot about, but I could process that, and I could read those a lot easier. I didn't have to keep going back because it was factual. So it you know, the way the brain works and processes information is really interesting to me, and luckily, you know, I thought at the time, oh, I'm never going to be able to read again, and this is like, it's robbed me of my enjoyment of books. But that's how I ended up, say, sort of getting into biographies, and from then on found all these wonderful stories, first of all in books, and that's sort of how, and then I just, you know, I thought, well, there's so many authors sort of writing about this stuff now. That's the thing, years ago there wasn't, and then all of a sudden these books started to come out, and then, you know, the reason I started the website, little things like going onto Twitter and looking at, like, on this day, you know, a lot of people post about what happened on this day, and you scroll through and there's like 20 posts on baseball players and, you know, football players, and then like 1 or 2 on women, and I just thought there should be more. You know, it's like all this stuff is about men, and there's very little about women. So, you know, when you start to sort of realize that and realize how many stories, women's stories, are written out in whatever century, and I think the further back you go, like sometimes, you know, obviously the stories are even more erased, and then you discover that they are there, you know, but men have written the books, so that's why we're not, you know, we're not included. And I think, you know, when I've discovered all of these women, for me, that you know, there's now people making films about them, there's people writing books, there's people, you know, the whole sort of let's tell these women's stories thing has taken off in the last few years, and I sort of started it about 4 years ago, but there are so many more people now doing it, and you know, they've obviously had the benefit of being like qualified historians. I'm not, you know, I taught in a high school and a college for a couple of years, but that's as far as it goes. But obviously, you know, those people have got redress to getting a publisher and getting a book out, and that was my initial idea, in the, you know, way back in the beginning. But once you go into these things, you realize it's a lot harder to actually get your, you know, if you've got a book and you want to write a book and you've got an idea, it's a lot harder to sort of get it out there. So is that why, can I ask, because Dragon Cloud Press is your publishing company, is that a company you've set up yourself to publish the books through?
Well, just like I say that my books are complete, I say that I am a publisher.
Well, that's brilliant, because I think there's this whole thing about do it yourself now, and if you, you know, there's no need to go sort of chasing a publishing deal, because if you're smart and, you know, you can set up your own publishing company and do it yourself these days. So I think that gives women even more freedom to write books and to, you know, be creative and do something like this. So it's brilliant. So yeah, tell me a bit more. I mean, the books, there's there's 3 in the first set, and then I think there's 4 in the second lot of books altogether, isn't there? I think, is that, have we got that right? Have I got that right?
Yeah, so there's 7 books in the series, and I had the first 3 printed all together earlier this year, and the final 4 are going to arrive this week at my house. They're being
Can I ask, what was it like when you got the box for the first time, and like your book, this baby, this project that you've been working on, you know, when you open that box and you see that book in, you know, in its, you can hold it, you can smell it, you can see it. How did that feel for you? Must have been... It
was amazing, because the printers I'm working with are really good. So that we specially chose the paper. It's recycled paper, and it's beautiful paper. And I feel like sometimes the screen can be more flattering for images, and sometimes the hard copy. But in this case, the hard copies look better than the screen version. My files. So that was really lovely to see, and they feel nice as well. The papers have this beautiful texture, and they smell, you know. So yeah, that's great. But I mean, there is also this thing where if you're a creative person, you're creatively inclined, like often by the time you finish something, you kind of want to move on to the next thing, and you're done with it.
Yes.
But then when you finish something and then a whole bunch of copies turn up at your house, and you realize that now is actually when the work starts. Like,
that's it. And then you've got to promote it. You've got to, you know, you've got to get on the blog.
Now I have to
do the interviews. You've got to get out there and sell the book. But I mean, also, I mean, people, for people who don't know your work, not only did you write the books, but you also did all the illustrations, which are beautiful. And we can see some here in the background. But I must tell, like, listeners and readers that they can actually purchase like postcards. I've looked at your art, and you know, so you're multi-talented, really, because not only can you write and produce these wonderful books, a whole series of books, you know, some people struggle just to write one, but you've got this whole series. It's, you know, it's concise, but it's covering so much, and then there's this beautiful artwork that goes with it. So I'm really interested, what came first, you know, like your interest in writing a book, or your art, or was it did it sort of all just gel together at the same time? And you know, did you do some paintings first and think, oh, you know, I could base my book around this particular painting, or was it the other way around?
Actually, the hunger for context is the thing that was first. This really deep need to have some understanding of what is this world that I'm living in from when I was a kid. Yeah, and I studied art history.
Right.
And when I did that, I started keeping scrapbooks of history, so that this happened then and this happened then, in order to try and form some sort of narrative.
Wow.
At that time, and it wasn't until I started reading feminist literature that really gained momentum, and it started turning into something that made sense to me and that could be continuous. And then I just read like a monster. Like I just read everything I could until the narrative was something that I could, like complete, obviously not exhaustive, but a potted history that had a beginning with the Big Bang, and
a middle,
also
and an end.
I could talk about neoliberalism.
Yes.
Which is the current political context that we're in.
Right.
Yeah, so it was the reading, the need for context, the reading, and then the need to distill all that reading into something that I could share, and that's what drove these books. And then the illustrations are just because painting is something I really enjoy, and I also wanted to create books that feel undemanding for the reader. Like I want to offer an overview. They're each really short. You said that and you saw that already, but they don't have a spine. So they're like a magazine. And I wanted to do that on purpose because I wanted, women who are busy or women who want to prepare themselves for further knowledge, like not actually commit to reading huge amounts of information. I wanted women to feel like these books aren't demanding. You can have an overview with just not too much investment of time and energy, and it's friendly to you. It's not on you.
I can see, but I mean that the cover would make me want to pick that book up if I saw it on somebody's coffee table. Any of the covers behind me, because they do look interesting, and I think the illustrations make you want to open the book and read them. So I think it's good to have something visual as well, a visual reference. But what would you say the age range of your sort of readers? Who are the books aimed at? Are they aimed at a very wide range of readers, or are they aimed at, because it says on your website the questions that women are asking about things like politics and religion, and I'm still asking myself those questions, and I'm in my 50s and I haven't got the answers yet. And I've got a daughter who's in her 30s who's just becoming a mum for the first time, and so she's asking questions about herself all the time. And I've got granddaughters who are coming up to just about to be teenagers who I'm trying to instill in them that it's because I grew up in a very different world. I'm sure you did as well. My granddaughter's having to sort of negotiate being a woman or becoming a woman. There's things that I need to teach them. So are your books sort of aimed at younger readers, or are they just aimed at generally at women?
I really wanted to make them for as wide an age range as possible, and particularly younger readers, because I remember hungering for something like this from like as early as I remember. But I couldn't quite achieve. There's too much brutality. If you want to talk honestly about what patriarchy has done to women. So I tend to say 17 plus.
Right.
Yeah, 17 plus, for sure. And then I would say that if someone wanted to give these books to a woman younger, or then read them first.
Yes,
and Gage,
absolutely,
because
absolutely.
a 15-year-old girl can be ready for these or not, I don't know. It would have to be something that people would have to gauge individually. And I would say the first 3 books are more accessible in terms of the content.
Right.
But the 5th book is the war period, the World War period. Talks about eugenics, like talks about some very difficult things.
Complex subjects.
Yeah. It was the hardest one to write.
I can imagine, yes, because it's I can imagine.
I actually thought about sharing with you something about the fourth book, because it's your period. It's your, yeah, and I would just be really curious. Like I thought I could tell you a little bit about it and the women in it, and then I'm sure that you will have. I'm sure that you'll want to tell me about women I've never heard of, and I'm really curious.
Okay.
Yeah, because the fourth book in my series is kind of like the establishment, the Industrial Revolution, the origins of capitalism, and the slave trade. And so it talks about it includes a story about Abigail Adams writing a letter to John Adams when he was writing the Declaration of Independence during the American Revolution, and she wrote to him and said, "You need to include the ladies." And he wrote back to her and said no. So this confirmed that, you know, the common law that regulated chattel marriage and criminalized divorce and everything for women was going to be imported into the United States from Britain. And then it also talks about the suffragists and how they kind of responded to that by trying to win the vote. But also when it discusses the slave trade, I draw on a recent book that you might be interested in. It's only come out, I think, this year or last. No, I think it came out this year, not last year. It's called Wake, A Hidden History of Women-Led Slave Revolts.
Oh, I haven't heard of that.
Yes, by a woman called Rebecca Hall. A historian who's gone deep into the archives to find this history of women-led slave revolts. So one thing that I quote her saying is that on the slave ships in the transatlantic slave trade, the more women were on the ship, the bigger the likelihood of a revolt, which I thought was incredible. Yeah, and then it also talks about like Harriet Tubman, Sojourner Truth, Emma Goldman, the anarchist. And I mentioned Buffalo Calf Road women and Indigenous women who fought the United States Army on horseback in the 19th century.
Wow,
so
I'm gonna have to get the copies of the book now, because I love the idea that you're like bringing from, you know, Indigenous women as well, because there's so many stories out there. You know, I think there's enough white women, sort of English women, Australian women, Canadian women. Our stories are all kind of wiped out, but when you get the Indigenous women, their stories are wiped out even further. So I think, you know, that when I read stories about Indigenous women, whether it's from Australia or America or Canada or wherever, I love these stories even more, because, you know, they sometimes they've just been obliterated by the colonialism and the patriarchy, and that you know, we don't ever get to hear those stories unless somebody like yourself digs them out and or you know, works with other authors and promotes these stories in your book. So I love these stories. So you may have to come and do a blog post for us on like Indigenous women from New Zealand, because that would be fantastic to be able to learn more about, you know, women that I'm obviously not probably going to hear about very much sort of over here in England. So yeah, it's brilliant that we've got international guests who can kind of shed the light on women's history worldwide. That's you know, that's what I kind of like about talking to a whole range of people, because we're getting women's stories from different countries and from different backgrounds, and you know, every single story to me is one that needs to be told. So yeah, I think we may have to chat about that later. You can come and do a lovely post for us, and keep promoting the books as well. Sorry, I interrupted you, so carry on.
Yeah, that's an overview of that fourth book. I also really enjoyed finding out about some of the somewhat lesser known women from the suffrage period, like Edith Garud, who was famous for suffragettes.
Yes, the suffragettes. I mean, yes, when you find out, like, well, there's so many things, you know. I think in Britain it was in 2018, it was the centenary year. And that's kind of, I actually threw myself into that over here in Britain. I thought, you know, I thought I knew quite a lot about the suffragette movement, but I got involved in all of these brilliant things, and there were so many like free things going on, with like there was free talks from the Fawcett Society, and happened to have a couple of historians whose like work I really enjoyed. So I had this wonderful, they called it the month of Millie, after Millicent Fawcett, who was she was a suffragist in the UK, and so we had this month of Millie, and the whole idea was deeds, not words. So it was going to do things rather than writing about them. So I thought that was rather apt. And the most brilliant thing is we had in London, there was a huge thing called processions. So I don't know if you picked up on that. And basically, what they wanted to do was recreate the 1980, one of the huge marches in London, which had been one of the significant sort of protests. So they wanted to recreate this with volunteers. So there were thousands and thousands of women who all converged in Hyde Park on the anniversary of this march, and we were all given. I mean, the logistics of organising something like this was amazing. So the organisers did brilliantly, and so we all converged, and we all had to sort of wait in line, and we were all sort of filtered through this march, and we all had these coloured scarves, like red, green, purple and white, which were the colours of the suffragette movement. And as we walked the walk from Hyde Park all the way through London down to Parliament Square, they had overhead cameras, so it was like this whole moving green, purple and white, you know, snake. We were all holding the colours over our head, and it was the biggest, it was said it was the biggest sort of interactive piece of art that had ever been done. So to feel, and it was such an amazing atmosphere. There were all these women, there were, you know, some were dressed as suffragettes. One woman had like the Houses of Parliament made out of cardboard on her head, and it was a really fantastic atmosphere. All these women sort of just coming together and celebrating, you know, the fact that some women over 30 got the vote in 1918, and to be a part of that. And actually, you know, I remember sort of, I got a little shiver down my spine halfway through, and you just sort of look around, there were all these amazing banners that have been made by these women for months and months and months, recreating the old, you know, suffragette banners. And you sort of just look around and you think, I'm doing something that is, you know, celebrating something in history, but I was also making history on that day by being there. And I just sort of suddenly felt this wonderful connection with all of these suffragettes, you know, and all these women it really made me think about how much, you know, women had fought to get that vote and how important it is. And what I loved about it was there were so many young women, young girls, you know, shouting, "We want equal pay." And I thought, this is great, because, you know, these girls are learning, and they're with their mums, and they're learning about this now, and, you know, they're clued into it in a way that I don't think I ever was at that age. So yeah, I think all these sort of celebrations of women's, especially of the suffrage movement, has done so much to sort of, you know, bring this back into the public attention, that even though, you know, we got the vote 100 years ago, actually, like, there's so many more things that still need to change in terms of women's rights, and equal pay is just one of them. And when you actually look into the figures, we haven't kind of achieved that really. There are still so many things that we need to achieve, and but it's when you involve yourself in something and learn something that's so important, it was a privilege to sort of take part in that. But I also learned about so many women that I never heard of, and it keeps coming back as well, because I did an interview with somebody. The first interview we did was about Mary Mcarthur, who was a suffragist and a trade unionist, and I hadn't heard of her, but I realised I had actually seen her picture. We had a statue that was put up of Millicent Fawcett in Parliament Square, which I went to visit with my daughter, and Mary Mcarthur's picture was actually on there. So but I didn't know of her at the time. So it's amazing. There were so many. People talk about Emmeline Pankhurst, and people know, I think over here, Emily Davidson, who threw herself under the horse, or was trying to pin a flag on the horse and got trampled, depending on which reports. But they're the famous figures in the UK for us. But there were so many women, working behind the scenes, and so that year I sort of divided my blog posts up and I thought, well, let's have a look at English suffragettes, Welsh, Scottish, Irish, and Essex in my area. So it was really interesting, sort of looking at different areas of the UK and then sort of seeing how women reacted to it. And the Scottish suffragettes were very, very militant and wanted to bomb and blow up things and but whereas the Welsh suffragettes were more sort of, let's do it peacefully. So it was really interesting looking at how many how all these facets in the suffragette world, that some people weren't, some people were against the militant action, and there were different sort of branches of the suffragettes here. And I didn't really know very much about that before, but after that whole year and months of kind of immersing myself in suffragettes, it was it's a really I learned so much more, and that's something I really enjoy doing, and or reading somebody's book and picking up things that I haven't actually, I don't really know much about, because it's surprising. I think we know a lot about this stuff, but when we actually delve into it, we sort of just know the basic facts a lot of the time, and it's when you fill the detail in, for me, that the picture comes alive. So did you concentrate more on sort of on the suffragette movement in New Zealand, or did you cover sort of America and England and the whole sort of thing in your books?
My books don't focus on New Zealand because they're an effort, as I say, to do an overview. And one of the things I wanted to create an overview about is, what are the dominant systems? So they're very much about what, so if you want to understand the dominant kind of systems of power that we live with today, you have to understand a bit of US history. You have to understand about Europe. And so I do include New Zealand, and my sixth book as well is very much global, as well as the second one on matriarchy. But as soon as there's like when I talk about the creation of patriarchy, I use Gerda Lerner's book called The Creation of Patriarchy, which focuses on Sumer and then Babylon. So as soon as there's some sort of story about how power is consolidated or created or established, or to kind of look at the center of that power, or that construct fabricated power, or whatever you want to call it. But when I talk about that suffrage period, I'm really trying to do something that you indicated, which was basically to show that there isn't one. And see, personally, I'm an anarchist, so one of my favorite figures from that period is Emma Goldman, who actually said that there's some risk in framing the vote as a right if the state is an imposition, because you're basically framing what is in fact an imposition as a right, and that's a paradox. And then when I write about someone like Buffalo Carthroad woman, a Native American woman who fought the United States Army on horseback, what would she have said about fighting for the women's vote? Like, I think she might have laughed at the idea. And that's one of the costs of for instance, leaving out Indigenous history, because you don't get, not only do you not get the stories, but you don't get the perspective, and the perspective is also a really important aspect of context in terms of understanding the world today. Historical context is important, geographic context is important.
Very much.
But the kind of, I don't know what else to call it, philosophical context, if you only get the suffrage story and you only get the story of particular suffragists, and you then are led to believe that every woman agrees with not only suffrage as a strategy, the fight for the vote as a strategy to improve women's lives, but also the particular way of doing it. If you then believe, like, oh, Emmeline Pankhurst kind of represented women at this time, like that isn't, that's not true.
But she didn't. A lot of people think she spoke for every woman, and and she didn't. And there were a lot of like branches of and groups of women who went off and formed different organizations, and that's what surprised me, how many sort of different organizations they were, and they all had this sort of slightly different idea about how to effect political change, for me, it was like I hadn't realised that there were some people who were pacifists, so some women who didn't agree with the more radical forms of suffrage, and I think we don't get taught that in the history lessons in school. We get taught about the suffragettes, but they do seem to, even now, and it's been a long time since I've been in a classroom, but from talking to teachers, the people don't really kind of realise that there was all these other sort of subgroups and different people with different political views that wanted to do things slightly differently. And then they did give up during the war as well, and even that was sort of argued. There were some suffragettes who wanted to carry on, but they felt it wasn't quite the done thing to everything needed to be poured into the war effort. But there were some suffragettes and some quite militant ones who really did want to carry on, but they had to kind of toe the line and realize that it would probably actually be a bad thing, and public opinion wouldn't go down very well. And I'm still learning about all of this stuff. Like, it's just amazing. I'll find another book and there'll be another sort of there'll be another woman that formed another sort of group or had different views. So I do find it really, really interesting, and it is difficult for one woman to speak for all. We all have different ideas, don't we, on different things, and it's like politically, I'm not sure where I stand now at all. I think I've always been fairly sort of left wing, but even that sort of, I'm not sure where I stand at the moment, because politically in Britain, I think we've done such a hole. I know that I'm not. I'm definitely not. I don't support our government at the moment. I really think they've done a terrible job with everything, but I also don't have much faith in the other side either. So I think at my age, I'm just sort of at that age, I'm thinking, well, none of the politicians in the mainstream actually talk to me in any way, shape or form. So I think it's interesting how our politics change as we get older. And I wouldn't say I was an anarchist, but I like some of the ideals behind it. But it's,
I think that's one of the things as well, like saying that Emmeline Pankhurst didn't necessarily speak for all women, but in another way she did. One of the things that I found when I've looked at women like her, and my own story is an absolutely incredible book. I stand with I'm with Emma Goldman on the anarchy and on questioning suffrage as a motive. But I also in the fifth book talk about Rosa Luxemburg, who was a socialist, who felt like Simone de Beauvoir did earlier on in her work, that socialism preceded feminism, that women couldn't be free until we had economic equality, and economic equality was a socialist question. And so but so when you can read like Rosa Luxemburg, Emma Goldman, Emmeline Pankhurst, and get completely different take on the nature of oppression, what to do about it. But there's something about these women that is so universal, and to me that is what comes back to like what I was saying before about the knowledge that the world we live in right now is not how it is antithetical to human nature. That's coming out of them in their writing. Like you don't just, it's not just intellectual positioning or tactical or you know, because I'm not a reformist, and I'm quite allergic to reformism, and I think that suffrage is ultimately a reformist movement. But when you read Emmeline Pankhurst, she doesn't write like a reformist who's, you know, fixated on the specifics of legislation. You know, she is just so wholehearted and so passionate about women, and she cares. Like, she first kind of politicized as a feminist, working as what was called a poor law guardian, and she was seeing women in workhouses, and she was seeing the state that you know, women and pregnant women and young women with children, raising children by themselves, were put in like in these workhouses, and based on that, she just became this strident voice for women. And then for me, the how was kind of secondary, like the fact that she was a suffragist secondary to the fact that she cared about that more than she cared about public opinion, which is also what I respect about, you know, her militant position on suffrage. You know, the need to stand for these women through by any means necessary, you know, even if it got her imprisoned, even if it, you know, everyone hated her, even if she got ridiculed, was you know, and not doing that as a martyr, but doing that out of love and because it was true, because these women were mistreated. Yeah, that to me is one of the overriding primary beautiful things about Herstory is finding that there is this divergence of opinion, but it seems secondary to this incredible spirit, which is in all of us, because it is that part of us that says, you know.
I think it's, you know, as women, we choose how we take on the fight, don't we? And I think, you know, over the years, I would say, I was quite strongly feminist when I was in my 20s and 30s, because I was just awakening to this, you know, this realization that, oh wow, you know, like, men rule the world. I can't do this. Why is my mother still asking me to do the dishes, and my brother gets to sit, you know, and watch TV? So, but because I was brought up in the born in the 60s and grew up in the 70s, so I suppose I was aware of all this sort of the feminist movement, but it wasn't until I sort of got into my sort of 19, sort of 20, and I was at college, and you come into sort of more, you know, you do classes, you end up talking to lecturers and stuff when you're at college, and you sort of become awake to this stuff. But then I started to question things like, you know, why do my parents treat my brother differently to me? Why does he get away with more? Why, you know, is it because I'm the eldest, or is it because I'm a woman? Why, you know, why doesn't he get asked to do like household chores? And then you start to question that, and then you read books, and like you say, you know, when you decide that you have to sort of fight against these things, you then have to decide sort of what, you know, how you're going to do that. And you know, I over the years, I think, you know, as you get older, you change as well. So, you know, now I think if I hear of anybody who's female and doesn't use their vote, I'm really kind of like, you have to do this, you know, you have that power, and women fought for that. And one of my daughter's friends, you know, she said, oh, she's abstaining from voting. I'm like, I was screaming down the phone saying, you can't do that. You know, people died for this, you know, for you to have this right, and you have to do it. But how you choose to fight, you know, the patriarchy, because we do come up against it like every single day. You know, I do as a woman, and I see things and I hear things, and I think, oh, you know, should I speak out and correct that? Sometimes I do, sometimes I don't, you know. But it's we have to choose as women, and I think the idea that you said about these books your books answer questions, and I'm wondering, I'm sort of taking myself back now to that sort of 20-year-old me who was asking all those questions, and like you said, I think your books would have explained them really well for me and given me more of an insight. And I think that's, you know, as you say, when you're at a certain age, you're looking for something that gives you, you know, some of these answers. You won't maybe find all of them,
No.
but so I think, yes, I get the idea now that your book is there to sort of give people the you know, some of these answers, and then sort of, you know, go off and read these other books and these works and find those answers. You have to find them yourself, but what you're doing is sort of giving women a starting point, and you know, from history and right the way through. And I think that's brilliant, because you can dip into different periods of history, but like you say, sometimes you need to see you know, the whole picture, and understand that patriarchy's been there right from, you know, when we were amoebas, right the way up to like present day, and things we still haven't, you know, we're not living in that perfect world, are we, Renee? I think there's so many things that, you know, still need to be addressed in terms of what women can do, to, you know, to have more equality. I still don't feel that we, you know, we have that, in a lot of things. It's too much of a bigger conversation to sort of go into what needs to be done, but you know, I feel this every day. Women get paid slightly less than men, you know, the way we get treated at work, it's still there, you know, and with all the Me Too movement, and I do a lot of like stories about women in the film industry, and it never ceases to amaze me, you know, this casting couch thing, and it was still going on with Harvey Weinstein, and it just, you know, it goes back to the beginning of the film industry, and it's been like that from day one, and we still haven't managed to change it. So, you know, they're the sort of questions and things that I think, if you're starting out on that journey into feminism, or you want to find some of the answers to that question, then I think, yeah, people are going to find this in your book, aren't they, Renee? So I think this is fantastic. So where can let's tell people where they can actually get the books from, because are you selling them as a whole set, or can people buy them individually?
At the moment, you can still buy the first 3 individually, and I'm selling the set of the first 3 as a bundle as well, and then the last 4 as a bundle only. Yeah. So yeah, you can buy the set, or you can buy.
You can sort of buy the first 3 and have a little taster and see, you know, if you like them, and then hopefully like people will buy the next one, and it's sort of a bit like a cereal then. So they can have a little taster at the beginning, and then if they really like it, then they could. I think that's a brilliant idea, because it's and giving, like, you know, putting the first 3 books, I think, yes, people, you know, people will read those and then think, oh, I want to carry on now. I don't think you can sort of stop, but you've only got half the history, haven't you? So they're going to have to find the other half to find out what happens, you know, later on. So yeah, it's been fantastic talking to you, Renee. I have to ask this question. Out of all the women that you've written about, who is, I think I asked at the beginning, but who really is your sort of favourite? Would it be Emmeline Pankhurst, or would it be somebody else? Who was the most, so the woman that you really enjoyed writing about, or the, you know, the most out of? I know it's hard to just pick one, but if you had to, and you know, maybe somebody we haven't heard of, that would be brilliant to just throw a name in there and tell us who you enjoyed the most.
If I'm very brief, can I say 3?
Yes, no, 3 is fine. 3 is fine. We'll have a 1, 2, and 3 in no particular order.
So one of them comes from book 3, one from book 4, and one from the last book, which is on neoliberalism. And that last one would be Vandana Shiva, who is one of the most vocal critics these days on neoliberalism. She's also a scientist. She does seed saving, and she is also very much spiritually inclined. So she doesn't make a distinction between talking about the material realities of oppression and and being spiritual as she is, which I find incredibly refreshing, and I like those voices which are expansive enough to include all of that. And she's one of those people, so I really admire her. And then I would say in the third book, I talk about Matilda Jocelyn Gage, who is one of the lesser known first wave feminists. So she wrote a book in 1893 called Woman, Church and State. And it is one of the most incisive analyses of patriarchy that you could possibly find still now. And I think for that reason, it's for that reason that she was marginalized, because the book doesn't really lend itself to a reformist reformist conclusions. Like patriarchy looks completely irredeemable when you read Matilda Jocelyn Gage's work, but it was also explicitly inspired by living among Native American women, the Haudenosaunee. So she saw how these women lived. She was made an honorary member of the Mohawk clan.
Amazing.
And realized that she had more freedoms within this group of people who were from a completely different culture to the one in which she was raised. Than she had with her own. So the first chapter of her book, Woman, Church and State, is called The Matriarchate. And she looks at matriarchies from around the world, having seen one, having lived with the among the Haudenosaunee. And actually that brings me to, I know you're wrapping up, but I wanted to say that brings me to another point you made earlier about Indigenous women and Indigenous histories, because I feel frustrated when I talk about Matilda Jocelyn Gage and how inspired she was by Haudenosaunee women there. I can't name any of these women. She doesn't either. I don't know why, but it's quite difficult to talk about the specific women who then actually enabled some of these first waves to radicalize, because they learned from these Indigenous women about how it is that people can live together. So I think, and then the last person I would mention, I've already mentioned several times, Emma Goldman.
I knew she was going to figure in the top three there somewhere.
Because again, she's an anarchist, and I used to think, I don't know if I bought into it, but a lot of people have this idea of anarchy that they've kind of passively acquired from the culture, which is that it means basically chaos and everyone for themselves. And I think that's a projection, and it's ironic, because capitalism is the system that pits everyone against each other and every man for himself. That's capital. Anarchy, when I read anarchists, they understand that freedom and responsibility are basically the same thing. So reclaiming your freedom is reclaiming responsibility. And I feel like anarchists have this spirit in their voices which shows that they're up for that, and they're up for a world in which everyone does that, and the state can't possibly manage it. It's a contradiction, you know. The state can't be in charge of everybody doing that. You know, they can't regulate it or monitor it, or you know what I mean?
Yes.
So I find that spirit in the work of Emma Goldman, and
I think I need to go and read some more. I need to read more Emma Goldman. I'm quite interested by that, because I do feel like, you know, the whole, like, if you understand what's happening in the UK at the moment, I mean, you know, the capitalism is just not working here for a lot of people, and Brexit, and you know, there's a lot. I see it on Twitter every day, and you know. I sort of see I see all these different arguments, and like I said to you, I've sort of come to that point where I really don't know where I stand politically on a lot of things, you know. And I say I used to be fairly left wing, but I think I'm probably heading more towards that direction now, because I think, you know, the state we're in as in the UK, it's I don't want to say too much, but you know, we're not in a very good place at the moment, and capitalism is only working for, you know, certain members of our society, and for the majority of us, it's giving us a really hard time. And then, you know, throw a pandemic in with that, and you've got a capitalist government, it's always going to be the wealth of the nation, you know, before the health of the nation. So we're kind of when there's a lot of people not very happy at the moment with our government in the UK, but whether, you know, at the voices will be strong enough to get things done, and maybe, you know, move people along in getting rid of the government. I mean, I've got to say, like in New Zealand, like you've got a fantastic Prime Minister, Jacinda Ardern, haven't you, there, who's been doing like so much in the COVID. The things I've been reading, I think
I can't stand it.
You can't stand it. No, I think it's great that you've got a woman head of state, but then we look at Margaret Thatcher as our first woman.
Yeah, I mean, as I said, I'm an anarchist, and so I cannot be.
No.
You know, I'm living currently in a climate where the narratives that people speak day to day are coming so much from the top down. Governments work in rhetoric; they don't work in values. They don't operate according to values, but they can convince you that they do with propaganda and with pretty slogans. Right. And when you have a government like ours, a liberal government, who's telling everybody to be kind and has a smiling,
yes,
like with a smile, and everything that we do is for you. And then people buy into that, and they're walking around.
I suppose they do. I don't really know much about New Zealand politics. I just, you know, I kept hearing like that it's great that you've got this woman Prime Minister, but I don't really know, you know, I don't really know anything about New Zealand politics really. But yes, I can kind of see that would be quite cloying as well, and it's just as bad as, you know.
I guess as well, like for me, there's this woman from the UK called Ray Story, who I used to be in touch with, who's an amazing writer, and she has this line, I will try and remember it properly, where she says the purpose of feminism is not to create a shining walkway for a female leader, but to, you know, to improve the lives of women overall. I can't remember the second part of that sentence. It's something to that effect. And I'm really not interested in celebrating people in positions of authority because they're in a position of authority. I can't be led to being interested in that. So I know I'm supposed to be about Jacinda Ardern, and I'm supposed to feel really lucky that we have her, not Boris Johnson. But the thing is that when you're an anarchist, you just can't really get enthusiastic about career politicians at all. Like I can't really conjure that in myself as much as anyone tells me that I should feel the need to.
No, I totally agree. I've had arguments and discussions with like friends, you know, over the last sort of 18 months, and you know, I think one discussion, and she said, you know, we should just have like one of the people running the country, but then, you know, absolute power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely, doesn't it? So I think, you know, it's a very hard thing to say. Even if there was like a sort of revolution and a people's party took over, there is always going to be somebody who's going to have that power, and whether it's man or a woman, or it's the nature of governments, isn't it? But we could talk about this all night. It's really fascinating. I'll have to come and I'll have to gen up on my politics, which at the moment I'm so politicked out with everything that's going on in the UK. I just sort of think, it's the same thing every day in the newspapers, and I think I've got fed up of reading it now, so I just sort of switch off and go and read my books on women's history instead, and just sort of try and concentrate on that, because politics is just it's like, and it's terrible, you know. You can't talk to anybody about it in this country because everybody's got like opposing views, and that's really shocking, you know, when you start to talk to friends and you realize that like your people you've known for years suddenly have these views and you never ever thought, you know. So that's been quite surprising.
The nature of the world we live in.
It's
now the nature is that these divisions are becoming more and more splintered and more apparent at the same time. So
absolutely.
Someone you could have got along with before, or agreed with, or agreed to disagree with, or whatever. Now it's like everything from whether you have a 2 or 3 ply face mask, or like all of these things. It's like tiny decisions that you make through the day are now politicized and high stakes attached to it. So
we are living in very, very strange times, Renee, but I think it's fantastic that we've actually got to chat today to talk about your books. Now I'm definitely going to have to order a set for myself so that I can have a look at them and read them. So you'll be getting an order off of me, I think, at some point, maybe for a Christmas present for my daughter or something. And we'll definitely have to have you back, I think, and have another chat, or maybe get you to do a blog post. So I think that would be really interesting. But it's been absolutely fantastic to chat to you. Just to plug your website, where can people buy these books? What is the link? We will put it on the website anyway, but just tell the listeners where they can go. You've got a Facebook page as well, haven't you, I think? And a Twitter.
Yeah, so my publisher brand is Dragon Cloud Press.
Yeah.
So my website is dragoncloudpress.com. And then you can find me by searching Dragon Cloud Press on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. That's about all the social media I can handle.
We'll put the link.
And if you follow me, that'd be massively helpful, because I have absolutely no social media prowess.
Well, that's the thing. You have to start somewhere, don't you? It's taken me like about 4 years, I think, to get 2,000 followers on Twitter, and yet when I've had accounts for other things, you know, it's really easy. It's actually quite hard to engage people to come and like read what you've written and stuff like that. I found I had like had different accounts for different things, and it was much easier to pick up followers. It's quite hard. But yes, guys, ladies, everybody out there, if you're listening to the interview today and you really want to help Renee, then please go and buy the books, because I think people will find them really, really interesting. They can also get postcards as well, can't they, Renee, of your artwork? I think there's some lovely ones on there for that complement the books as well. So if people want to buy a nice postcard and frame it and have your artwork on their wall, they can do that as well, can't they? So I think that's excellent. So guys, women, anybody who's listening today, go out, buy Renee's books, go to the website, have a little look, see what she does, and keep supporting all these wonderful writers and artists and authors that are telling women's stories. Renee, it's been an absolute delight to chat to you this evening. I'm going to take myself off to bed now. You've got the rest of the day, so I hope you're going to have a lovely day. Go off and do some nice things today, or just chill out and relax after this interview. But it's been fantastic talking to you, and we wish you all the best with the books. Keep in touch with us, and we'll get you back for a follow-up maybe in the new year and see how things have gone, and hopefully you'll get some orders before Christmas for your books, and you know, we can see the sales going up a little bit, because that's the idea. So go and buy Renee's books, buy her art, go and buy the books, and then they will, you know, they'll get these questions. They'll have a lot of reading to do and lots of things to go and pursue, won't they, if people read your books? That's the idea. Fantastic. Thank you so much, Renee. We wish you a good day, and thanks for catching up with us. Take care.
Thank you.
Just wait, let's find the stop button. Where's it gone? I can't find the stop record now. I should just edit that bit out in the end there. But thank you so much, Renee. I'm gonna have to like sign off now, because I'm gonna have to get myself to bed. Otherwise I'm gonna be like death warmed up. But thank you so much for it's been really nice to catch up with you. I wished I'd agendaed up on my politics a bit more now, because there were so many things that I could not. I forgot to ask you and sort of interject. But I think let's hope. I shall listen back to this tomorrow when I get home from work. Would you like a copy of the audio file or the video file for your website, or are you quite happy to just link into me?
Yeah, I'll just link to you.
Cool.
Yeah.
Okay then. Well, it'll probably go up. It won't take a lot of editing. I should just clip the ends and make sure I don't get me sort of, we don't get this bit in. So it'll probably go up. I'm trying to think. It'll probably be next week's podcast. So we've got one up for this week. Give me a chance to just edit it up and do a little sort of write up. Your links are on the site now as well, so we'll keep plugging those.
Thank you.
Every now and then I shall, post a few links, things out, and just say, go to your websites. That's all part of the deal when you come and chat with us, is that we'll continually sort of give people a reminder. And our guests, if you've been a guest on here now, you get to be a VIP, so that just means we give you lots of exposure and you become our friend. So you are now officially a friend of Hidden Herstory now. across the other side of the world, so that's brilliant. But yes, just thank you for giving your time tonight. I did wonder whether there was whether I'd got the time wrong, and I did go and check. I sort of sat here, and the funny thing was I had a friend this afternoon, an elderly chap that I sort of go up and look after, and I forgot we do a Zoom call every week, because since COVID he's sort of quite lonely, and I forgot he's one this afternoon. I was so busy doing things, and I thought, I know what it's like. I sort of sat there and I thought, I've got the time wrong, so I went back and checked, and I thought, no, there's definitely a problem. And when you didn't turn up, I thought, I thought I'll sit here and do a little video for the tour. So I didn't waste that time. So it's actually quite useful. So don't worry about us being a bit late, but I will have to go off and go and have my sleep now, because otherwise I'm going to be like definitely off in the morning. It's the worst bit about my job. I love my job, but I have to get up at 5 in the morning every morning, and it's a killer. But once I'm out and I've got my coffee, I'm all right. But I hope you have a good day, and thank you so much, Renee. Take care.
Thank you.
Cheers. Bye-bye.
Have a good sleep.
Yeah, I will do. Thank you.
See you.
Bye-bye. What's that? So we stop recording.